My name is Jim Tierney, and this is a talk on live bindings titled Rapid Mobile Application Prototyping Using Live Bindings and the PrototypeBindSource. This is basically a 34-minute demo where I start off by creating a new phone master detail application. I explain how that application works. I make some customizations to the application. Eventually, I get around to replacing the PrototypeBindSource with the client data set, and then I make a few more customizations. I'll be talking about, of course, the LiveBindings Designer. I'll be talking a little bit about deploying and running mobile applications, laying out controls for mobile devices, and in addition to talking about the PrototypeBindSource and the client dataset, I'll also be talking about TBindingsList, TActionsList, TBindSourceDB, TListView, and TTabControl. I'm going to show how to take an application that uses the PrototypeBindSource and convert it into an application that uses the client dataset instead. First, I'll create a new FireMonkey mobile application. I'll choose the phone master detail template. The project that has been created has a tab control, tab control 1, and under the tab control, two different tab items or tab pages. The first page displays a list view, and on the list view we see a picture and a name. On the second tab we see a larger picture, a name, and a title. There are some non-visual components on this form. We have the bindings list, which has our binding components, which I'll talk about later, an action list, and then here's the PrototypeBindSource, which provides the data for our application. I'll select the PrototypeBindSource and expand the field defs, and here we can see the fields that are defined for this PrototypeBindSource. Skip the first one because it's not used in this application, and I'll delete it by hitting the delete key. I'll select the first field definition, and we can see that the field type is a bitmap and the generator is contact bitmaps. The second field definition is also a bitmap, and it's also generating contact bitmaps. The L at the end means it's just a larger format. The next field is a string field, and it's got a generator of contact names. And the last one is a string field and got a generator of contact titles. The generators are used to just generate some sample data that we can use when we're first putting together our application and we haven't yet created an actual data source such as a database table using, let's say, FireDAC or DB-Express. Let's look at the LiveBindings Designer to see how the PrototypeBindSource field definitions are used to connect to the controls on the two different tabs. First, I'm going to remove the elements on the LiveBindings Designer that aren't part of the bindings. Now I'll put the controls that are on the second tab on the right, and the list view is on the left. So let's go ahead and switch back to the first tab on the tab control with the list view. And we can see that we have an image and a name. So here the item text is bound to contact name, and the bitmap on the list view is bound to contact bitmap. The other connection between the list view and the PrototypeBindSource is not for connecting a particular field. It just defines a relationship between the PrototypeBindSource and the list view, so that the list view and the PrototypeBindSource are synchronized. By synchronized, I mean when we change the active record in the PrototypeBindSource, it also changes the item index in the list view, and the other way around. So if the user selects an item in the list view, it'll automatically change the active record in the BindSource. And when the active record changes in the BindSource, this causes all the controls that are connected to the BindSource to be updated. So for example, if I click on Adam Brown on the on the second tab, which has the links to these labels and this bitmap, the label will display the record that it contains Adam Brown and the title accountant in this bitmap. Over in the structure view, under Listview, you'll notice that there's a couple of strangely named components. I'm going to remove those. They're accidentally left in the template. They don't do anything, but they don't need to be there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on them and delete them. So now is a good time to run this application to see how it operates. I'm going to use the iPhone simulator. So what I'll do first, just to make the design appearance consistent with the runtime appearance, is change the designer to display the iPhone styling. This is not necessary. I mean, when we run the application on the iPhone, it's going to look like an iPhone application, independent of how the designer displays it. But just seems to be a good way to go if you're doing an application for the iPhone, so that you can see in general how it's going to look, and you might discover some problems with the layout. So I'll go ahead and choose the simulator, and we'll run the application. All right, we see the first tab with the list view, and we can click on items in the list view, and then it will go over to the second tab page and display the information about the item we clicked on. So I'll go back to the IDE, make a couple of enhancements to this application. The first enhancement will allow me to change the active record in the PrototypeBindSource without returning to the List View tab. So what I'll do first is add some actions to the action list. I'll open it by double-clicking, and we'll choose New Standard Action, and we'll choose the Bind Navigator Prior and the Bind Navigator Next actions. All right, and now we need some buttons to execute those actions, but before I do that, let me do something I often forget, is to set the data source of these actions. We'll set the data source property of both of these actions to the PrototypeBindSource. Now we'll add the buttons to the toolbar. First button I'll associate with the prior action. I'll also set the style to this up arrow. This button is designed to be on the left. It has rounded corners on the left side and a flat edge to go against another button that will appear on the right. Going to copy this button and paste it to create a duplicate. I'll change this to use the other action, and I'll change the style. I'm going to make these buttons aligned to the right, and I'm going to give it a margin to separate it from the right edge of the form. All right, so now we have two buttons that will allow us to move to the previous or next record while we're viewing this tab page. I'm going to go ahead and run this application, but instead of running it on the simulator, I'm going to run it on Win32. And I'm going to do this first by adding a platform, Win32, or 32-bit Windows. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because I find that it's more productive to develop the application on the 32-bit Windows platform if possible. That way I get a faster build time. So Windows really won't look at all like iOS, but I can test my application logic. So now I'm able to, running on Windows, I'm able to test whether these buttons work, and I can just turn it around quicker on 32-bit than I can on the iOS simulator. So we'll click on a item, and you can see that the next button, although it doesn't look at all like it will look on iOS, it does give us the same functionality. If we go back, let's just go all the way to the front. So now I'm at the first record. Go to the next record. We go back, we'll see that on the list view, the second item selected. That's because the list view is synchronized with the PrototypeBindSource, and by changing the active record in the PrototypeBindSource using those buttons, we also change the item index in the list view. All right, I'm going to add another enhancement. I'm going to put another control on this page. Before I do that, I'm going to add another field to my PrototypeBindSource. So double-click on the PrototypeBindSource and bring up the fields editor. And I'll add a field. You can see there's various generators here and various types of fields to pick from. You can also pick fields that don't have a generator down here. So I'm going to choose the generator called lorem ipsum, and I'm going to create a string field. All right, and I'm going to display this on my form using a memo. I could drop a memo control here, and then I'll bring it over to the right. I can connect it like so. Let me turn on word wrap. That's one way to do it. The other way would be to right-click on the field in the LiveBindings Designer, and you have this link to new control. And at that point, you could also choose memo, and then it would create a memo for you. You don't have to drop it from the palette, and it would create the connection. So here's the memo that it created here. I'll go ahead and delete that binding. Don't need that. All right. So now we have our memo displaying the contents of our new field. And what I want to do is I want to put the memo at the bottom of the form, and I'm going to have these other fields, these other labels at the top. Now, just laying them out like this looks fine right now, but if the orientation of the device is changed, then it's not going to look correct. And I'll demonstrate that in the designer by clicking this little button here. So if I do that, we can see that when the device is rotated, that the memo doesn't fit onto the bottom of the form. So what I'll do is use alignment and a layout component to address this issue. Put a layout component on the form. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reparent these three controls onto the layout. So I've selected these three controls, and I'll drag them onto the layout in the structure view. And now you can see that the controls appear underneath the layout node. Now what I'll do is I'll indicate that the layout is to be aligned at the top of the form. And I'll have the memo be aligned to client, meaning it'll take up the rest of the space on the form. Oops. Okay, so now when we change the orientation, you can see that the memo is still displayed at the bottom of the form. Okay, I've made my this other modification. Let's go ahead and run it on Win32 to see that it works properly. All right, we can see that the memo is updated with some generated text. One other change I'm going to make is to only use a single bitmap field. This samples using two different bitmap fields. I'm just going to use 1. So what I'll do is change the link that's pointing to this bitmap L1 to point to contact bitmap 1. And there's a couple of different ways to do this. I mean, when we're selecting a line in here, we're actually selecting a binding component. And so we can just select it like that, and then we can go in here and change the property of that component. So here, instead of L1, we could change it to bitmap 1, and you can see that we're no longer linked there. The other way to do it would be to grab the endpoint of this line and move it. That's one way to do it. Or the other way is to just draw a new link. So now I'm no longer using contact bitmap L1, so I'm going to go ahead and click on it and select it in the structure view, and I'll go ahead and delete it by clicking the delete key. All right. And we can see that our bitmap is properly displayed on this tab, and let's just double check that everything's still working on the other tab. Looks good. At this point, I've finished my modifications or customizations to this application, and I'm ready to convert it to use tclient dataset instead of a TPrototypeBindSource. All right, I'll drop a client dataset onto the form, and I'll add some sample data, or load some sample data. There's our client data set, and what we're trying to do is get all the lines that are pointing at this prototype bind source pointing at this client data set. There are different ways to go about it. One way is to draw lines connecting all the different components. The other way is to select the different links and change the properties, the data source, and the field name. Another way, which I'm going to demonstrate, is to first get the prototype bind source resembling the client data set by renaming the fields. So then once we have the fields named the same in the prototype bind source as they are in the client data set, then it's just a matter of changing all these bind links to point to this data source rather than the prototype bind source. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and rename fields. So the memo is going to display the notes field, so I'll change this field name here to notes. The contact name is going to be the common name. The contact title will be the category. And the contact bitmap will be graphic. Now in this case, the LiveBindings Designer didn't handle the rename completely. So we see that the image control is connected to the graphic field, but our list view is still connected to contact bitmap. And we'll see that it has the word invalid after the field name to indicate that this link is to a field that does not exist. So what we'll do is just connect graphic to the bitmap. And now we've corrected the link, and it doesn't display the other field that is no longer exists and is no longer referenced. After renaming, we can see that the second tab is displayed properly. Let's go ahead and look at the first tab. It looks good as well. So at this point, we have matching field names: common name, category, graphic, graphic, and notes to notes. So what we'll do is we need to select all the links on the form, and the easiest way to do that is to use the bindings list. Double-click on the bindings list. This displays all the binding components that are used to bind the various controls to the prototype bind source. We'll select them all, and where we see data source, prototype bind source, we'll change this to client data set 1. And now all of our lines are pointing at the client data source, client data set. And if we look at our form, we see that the list is now showing the images from the client data set and the common name from the client data set on the first tab. And on the second tab, we see the image, we see the common name, we see the category here, and the notes. So we'll go ahead and run that on Win32 to see that it works properly. Well, our buttons don't work properly. The navigation between the pages seems to work properly. So let's take a look. The buttons have actions, and the action is still connected to the prototype bind source. So let's just bring up the actions list editor. I'll multi-select the actions, and change the data source to the bind source DB, which is the bind source associated with the client data set. I didn't actually create there's a new component on this form, the bind source DB, and the client data set isn't actually a bind source that LiveBindings can consume directly, but it can be consumed if we have a bind source DB component that's connected to the client data set. And when we use the LiveBindings Designer, this component, the bind source DB, is automatically created. All right, we're no longer using the bind source. We're no longer using the prototype bind source, so we can go ahead and delete it. All right, this is a good time to try this out on the device. And when we're using a client data set, that's a part of what was originally called Midas. And if we go into the deployment options, under project deployment, we can see that we're not deploying any kind of Midas things. And so for some platforms, we need additional files to be deployed. So what we'll do is we'll click on this glyph here, add featured file. So we'll click that, and down here we see Midas library. And so the featured files are well-known things that you might have to deploy with applications that you built with Red Hat Studio. So Midas is one of the well-known things. I'm going to expand it. You can see for these platforms, there are things that you need to deploy if you're going to run on a different machine. So I'm going to go ahead and check that, and this is going to deploy what I need to run on the iOS simulator. And now, if we look in the deployment manager, we see that there's a Midas.dll file that's going to be deployed for Win32. We don't really need it now because we're not running on a different machine, but when we go over to iOS simulator, we can see that libmidas.dylib is being deployed. So let's go ahead and run this application on the simulator. And we can see our list view and click on the items and use the buttons. Go back. So our application seems to be working properly on the simulator. When we develop an application with the prototype bind source, we can only take the application so far because the prototype bind source doesn't have all the capabilities of other data sources. like the client dataset. The client dataset supports multiple levels of sorting. The PrototypeBindSource doesn't. So now I'm going to take advantage of that feature in the client dataset. I'll select the client dataset, and I'm going to set the index field names to category and common name. So this is going to sort the client dataset by category first, and then within category by common name. Let's go ahead and run our application on Win32 to see how that looks. If we go over to the Detail tab, we can see that the category is starting with A, and we can see that we're alphabetized by category. Common names are also alphabetized, but it doesn't really show up on the list view because category isn't shown. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a header in list view using category. So I'm going to take the category field and connect it up to item.header text. And let's go ahead and look at the first tab, and we'll see that we get a header item shown. Let's run the application, and we can see that the category is shown, and then within the category we have the fish that fall within that category. In the case where there are multiple fish within a category, the fish common name is alphabetized. In this application, the client dataset is on the form. Sometimes it's convenient to have the client dataset and other data components on a data module. This allows us to share the data components between different forms, or to share the data module unit between different applications. So I'm going to show how to move the client dataset and the BindSource DB components to a data module. I'll add a data module to and we'll go over to the form and choose the client data set and the BindSource and copy them. And actually I'm going to rename the data module unit. Just to make it a little clearer. We'll go to the designer and we'll paste in the data components. Now I'll go over to the form and choose the use unit command from the file menu. We'll use our data module unit. This is going to add the data module unit to the users list in the master detail underbar phone unit. At this point, the components from the data module are available to be used within the master detail phone form, but it's not shown in the LiveBindings Designer. The reason is that the LiveBindings Designer isn't aware that we are now using a new unit. So what we need to do at this point is choose the refresh command. Now, there's a menu in the LiveBindings Designer that's context sensitive. So because this object selected, we're not seeing the refresh command. So I'll click somewhere else, and we can see the refresh designer command. We'll choose that, and you can see that the client dataset and the BindSource from the other unit is shown in the LiveBindings Designer. So what we'll do is go over to our bindings list and select all of our binding components and change the data source from BindSource DB to data module 1 BindSource DB. So now our client dataset is no longer used for data binding, and all the lines are connected to the components in the data module. Let's not forget to do the actions list. So select the actions and change over to the data module components. Let's go ahead and run it on Win32. Make sure that everything's working properly. Okay, looks good. At this point, we can go ahead and delete the client data set on the in the BindSource DB on our form since they're no longer used. We've added headers and tested it on Win32, and we've added a data module and tested it on Win32, but it's a good idea to try it out on the simulator. All right, here are our headers. We can select bat ray. Seems to be working. Let's try to rotate. Make sure that our memo is still displayed properly. Seems to be working fine. That's the end of this demonstration of taking an application that uses PrototypeBindSource and converting it to use client data set. If you'd like to learn more about live bindings, here are links to the Doc Wiki, to my blog, and to Malcolm Grove's blog. Thank you for watching.
How were those items in the Listview created?
Oh, the Listview has built-in items. By default, when you first create a Listview, you'll see a text item, and then there's a setting in the properties for the Listview where you can identify the layout that you want in the Listview. So there's it's under appearance, so you can set the appearance to an image list, or there's different ones. I can't remember what all the name of the appearances are, but that one was the image list appearance, and so it had an image on the left and a text item next to the image. And then depending on how you've set the appearance, you'll see different elements in the LiveBindings Designer. So in that case, we saw a bitmap and we saw text. But if you had the original appearance that you see when you first drop a Listview, all you would see is text in the LiveBindings Designer.
The data for T-Client data set should also be deployed to the platform, or else where will the load the data from?
Yeah, for this example, I just loaded the data into the form. So it was in the form file, serialized in the form file, and so whenever the application ran and the form was loaded, it would just get the data out of the form file. Not really what you would do for a data application where you'd be editing data.
Could put it in the deployment manager and deploy it that way, probably.
You could put it in you could put it in a separate file and load it. But the reason I used the client data set was just because we have sample data for that, and it was an easy way for me to do a demo. Probably what you would really do is use like IB2Go and create a database table in IB2Go, and then hook up the live bindings to IB2Go through DB Express or through FireDAC. But the process is the same. I mean, you have a data set that you're binding to in all those cases.
So yeah, the back end changes, but what you were showing the live binding stays the same.
Yeah.
So quite another question on T-Client dataset is support saving to XML on Android.
Yeah, I can support XML on Android, yeah.
Yeah, there's two formats. There's XML and XML UTF-8 are choices for the type. This is the second parameter to save to file, load from file. And if you don't put a second parameter, or you could choose binary client data set. If you don't have a second parameter, it'll load the file or save to binary.
Right. mean, there was a question that I answered about, in the deployment manager, when you go into feature files and you expand Midas, it doesn't have something to check for Android. And that's because on different platforms we deliver Midas in different ways. On Android, there's no additional file to deliver. It's just Midas is just built into the executable. There's no library, so that's why you didn't see anything under Midas for deployment. But we support Midas on Android, iOS, Mac.
So sorry if this is related, but in the same vein as Midas distribution, what files are needed for SQLite distribution?
SQLite's on the device, so you don't need to deploy the SQLite itself. Or I'd have to look at, well, I mean, I don't think there's any, there might be something for DB Express, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe not. I don't think there's anything for FireDAC.
Yeah, there's nothing for FireDAC. Yeah. I
mean, you could just look, I don't have it in front. You just look under bring up that featured file list and see if there's something for SQLite. If there's nothing for SQLite, then it's all going to be automatically available when built into your application.
Please prepare a runtime data binding example. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I saw a question about. I mean, yeah, we can do one. We should do one, definitely. I mean, basically, the idea is that you would just create these components and set their properties. I mean, certainly, an example would help. Like, how do you create the components and so forth.
How do you deploy to an Android device? What is the path to the CDS file?
Yeah, there's something in some good information on the DocWiki about how to put files onto the device. It's different for the platform, but we have some routines to get information about where the directory is on the particular device.
What the path delimiter is.
Yeah, the path
forward,
delimiter.
backward, slash.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm pretty sure there's a pretty good DocWiki scenario for that.
Yeah, and
there's code snippet examples.
Yep.
Yeah.
That like the SQLite and IBLite mobile code snippets, you'll see in the code either on form create or on before connect, for example, the database. You'll see setting the database parameter of the task list database, tpath.getDocumentsPath plus path delim, which will put in the right forward or backward slash, plus the name of the string for the name of the file, in this case a SQLite DB file. But so tpath.getDocumentsPath is that first one. Anyway, go ahead. But that's look at the SQLite and the IBLite examples in the code, mobile code snippets directory that's on SourceForge and in the install. And look in the source for the main unit form source file, and you'll see those examples of getting the document path.
Is there a demo of setting up a list view and assigning items to it available?
I think on my blog I talked about the list view. I'll have to double check. I can't remember if I did a list view example or only list box examples. But they basically work the same way. You connect them up to the data set or the other data source.
And your blog is the URLs?
Oh, well, I think it's /Jim Tierney, Embarcadero.
Okay.
And Ray Konopka's got a session tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific time, effectively using list controls in mobile apps. And we also had Listbox and Listview in CodeBridge Mobile for iOS. The same information is usable for iOS and Android. And those replays are up there. But check out Ray's session tomorrow at 2 o'clock Pacific time.
So there's another question here. If Git support is coming to RAD Studio, I think there's a third-party support for that, but I don't think we have that baked in yet.
So it's system.io utils unit that has the calls for things like get documents path, and it does the right thing on iOS, Android, OS 10, and Windows. And that's where path to lim is defined as either forward or backwards / based on if-def of the platform.
Listview is really a really powerful control. I mean, we could do, originally I was thinking I would do a whole session on Listview and data binding. I mean, there's really a lot to it, what you can do, so try to get some more information out there.
Okay, so there's Jim's blog is blogs.embarcadero.com/Jim Tierney. I think I typed that wrong earlier. And there's his email address and DocWiki and Malcolm's blog as well. You've got some good information.
Yeah, those are on the screen now. So Malcolm's done live binding blog posts in the past as well.
Yep, malcolmgrows.com/blog. So,
and again, live bindings has been around, so we covered live bindings and I think Listview at Code Rage Mobile, so you can look at the replays. Those are past Code Rages are linked off the Code Rage page. You'll see it in the upper right-hand corner, links to other sessions from previous Code Rages.
And I think there were some rad actions on that as well, and a few other things. So,
but more is always good. This is a great topic for helping developers get stuff done fast. We did that rapid prototyping webinar, application prototyping, where we use live bindings and components. We did that in June, I think, with JT and with Steve. Steve was the chef, and I was the programmer. So we went through an iterative process using Listviews and components. One of the samples was the recipe example that's in the FireMonkey mobile.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. I think we're going to have some time here to get back on schedule again, which is good. So thanks for your time. Thanks for the great session.
You're welcome. Thank you.
A lot of positive feedback here in the questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.